Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. We're diving back into some good old Jane Austen today, more specifically Persuasion. And I have a confession to make. This was my second attempt to reading this book. Yes, I have DNF'd it once before, and we will get into why a little bit later in this video. But I did finish it this time, I promise. But first, as always, I will give you a detailed summary of the story, and timestamps are listed below should you wish to jump ahead. So, why don't you get comfortable with a cup of tea or any other beverage of your choice, and let's get into Persuasion. The story starts off introducing the Elliot family, meaning Sir Walter Elliot and his three daughters, Elizabeth, Anne, and Mary Elliot, with Mary being the only one married. The background here is that Sir Walter is a very vain man who's proud of his heritage, and 8 years previously, middle child Anne formed an attachment with a young sailor named Frederick Wentworth, who was a nobody. He had plenty of charm and determination, but no money or family heritage, which was the only thing of value in Sir Walter's eyes. Despite Anne and Frederick Wentworth being very much in love and wanting to get married, Anne was persuaded to let him go, not only by her father's disapproval, but also by Lady Russell, who is a close family friend. So they parted ways broken-hearted, and Wentworth left to join the war. Fast forward 8 years, and it is now 1814. Anne is 27 years old and is still unmarried. But Frederick Wentworth is a nobody no longer. He has become Captain Wentworth, a self-made wealthy man. Anne had secretly followed his progress over the years as he climbed his way up the career ladder in the Navy, and she knew that he was still single. But other matters were now concerning the Elliot family. Money was becoming a bit of an issue, and Sir Walter was persuaded to get a tenant for his grand estate and move his family into smaller accommodations in the party town of Bath. Anne, however, wasn't very into the idea of Bath and wanted to delay her move for as long as possible. So Sir Walter and the eldest daughter Elizabeth, along with a couple of friends, including Lady Russell, go to Bath, and Anne stays behind for a couple of months, living at the cottage of her sister Mary and husband Charles and their 2 boys. They often socialize with Charles's family, the Musgroves, who also live nearby, specifically his 2 unmarried sisters, Henrietta and Louisa Musgrove. I'm sorry for bombing you all with these names, but in all fairness, it isn't a Jane Austen novel without an enormous cast of characters. Soon enough, the chosen tenant, Admiral Croft and Mrs. Croft, move into the Elliot family estate. And Mrs. Croft just so happens to be the sister of none other than Captain Wentworth, which is of course a massive coincidence. This has poor Anne very nervous, as Wentworth might at some point come and visit his sister, and they are bound to be moving in the same social circle. And this, of course, happens quite early. Wentworth comes to stay with them for a while and begins socializing with the Musgrove family. He then came to the cottage to pay his respect to Charles and Mary Musgrove, and thus he and Anne were in the same room together for the first time in 8 years, and it was awkward. Anne then hears from her sister that apparently Captain Wentworth had told people afterwards that he found Anne very much changed and would hardly have recognized her. Because of this, Anne is convinced that he is still disappointed in her for letting him go. Then we have a brief POV change to Captain Wentworth, where we learn that he does still think about Anne, and he hasn't found anyone equal to her yet. But he is still determined to move on and find himself a wife. So Anne and Wentworth often find themselves at the same social gatherings, but they don't really speak aside from the expected pleasantries. One night at a gathering at the Musgroves, Anne couldn't help but notice that the two Miss Musgroves, Henrietta and Louisa, were practically fawning over him. Or, well, everyone notices it, and this causes some speculation on who of the two the captain will choose as his bride. So Anne had to listen to Mary and Charles speculate on who will be the new Mrs. Wentworth, and she wasn't exactly having a good time with that. But Henrietta soon became distracted elsewhere by the arrival of Charles Hayter, their cousin, with whom she had always had an attachment. But was this enough to lose interest in Wentworth? Maybe not. And Charles Hayter certainly disliked having a rival for Henrietta's affections. One day at the cottage, Anne was alone in the drawing room caring for one of Mary's sons who was sick. Suddenly, Wentworth arrives and asks where the other ladies are, to which she says that they are upstairs and should be down shortly. So he agrees to wait by the window, and there is an awkward silence where Anne focuses on tending to her sick nephew. Soon enough, they are joined by another person to make it even more awkward, Charles Hayter, who doesn't really speak to either of them, but just sits down to read the newspaper. A moment later, Mary's youngest son enters the room and starts bothering Anne. He's attempting to climb up on her back and is really annoying, and Anne tells him off, but he won't listen to her. Even Hayter tells the boy to stop bothering his aunt, but to no avail. Eventually, Anne can feel the boy being physically carried off her back. It is Wentworth who had come to the rescue, and he began playing with him instead. And she was very thankful for his interference, but also ashamed that she couldn't handle the situation herself. The rivalry continues between Hayter and Wentworth, but after a while Hayter stops coming by to social events, and Anne speculates that he might have given up in his pursuit of Henrietta. One day Henrietta and Louisa come to the cottage to ask Anne for a walk, and to which Mary also joined, and soon enough both Wentworth as well as Charles joined as well. It was a fine day, and they walked for a good while until they reached the estate where Hayter lived. Charles and Henrietta went down there to say hello, but the others stayed behind to wait. They split up somehow, and Anne finds a nice place to sit in the sun, and this is when she overhears a conversation between Louisa and Wentworth. Louisa admits to him that she and Henrietta had preferred their brother to marry Anne rather than Mary, and he had proposed to her first, but she had refused him. And this seemed like a great surprise for Wentworth to hear. So a little while later, Captain Wentworth went on a short visit to the seaside town called Lyme to see a friend who was staying there. And when he returned, he spoke so warmly of it that everyone wanted to go and see it for themselves. So it was then decided that Charles and Mary, Henrietta, Louisa, Anne and Wentworth were all to go there for an overnight trip. Once at Lyme, we meet Wentworth's friends, Captain Harville plus his wife, and Captain Benwick, who had apparently been engaged to Harville's sister, but she had tragically passed away about 6 months prior. As they're socializing that evening, Anne finds herself in the corner of the room with Captain Benwick, and she bonds with him over books and poetry, and she even gives him tips on books to help with grief. They continue hanging out in Lyme the next day, specifically walking a lot by the ocean. As they were leaving to get back to the inn, they passed a gentleman who was looking at Anne with clear admiration. Anne noticed his looks, and so did Wentworth, but no one said anything. Back at the inn, the company sees the same gentleman get into a carriage and drive off, and they ask the staff who the man was. To their great surprise, his name was Mr. Elliot, and Anne and Mary realized that he must be their cousin, who is also the heir to their father's estate. Before going back home, they decide to take one last little walk by the water. It was very windy now though, so they had to be careful when going down the steps. Louisa, however, was delighted to jump the last couple of steps for Wentworth to catch her. He humoured her once, but advised against it because of the wind. Louisa wouldn't hear of it and climbed back up the steps to jump one more time, although this time she jumped before he was ready and she fell and hit her head on the pavement. She was knocked unconscious and everyone panicked. The only one in the company to remain calm was actually Anne, and she sent Benwick to fetch a doctor and insisted that they bring Louisa inside somewhere while they wait. So they go back to the Harvilles' house, where the doctor concluded that she had had a bad concussion, but she will recover. It is then decided that Wentworth will bring back Henrietta to their parents, as she was severely shaken up by his sister's accident and wanted to go home, and someone must inform the parents of the accident. And through some convoluted exchanges, Anne ends up going with them. It was an awkward ride, and they didn't really speak much during it. Once they had reached Uppercross, however, Wentworth said that he thought it best if he was the one to break the news to the parents, as Henrietta was still very shaken up. He asked Anne if she agreed with this, and she approved of it, feeling very happy that he had wanted her opinion in the matter. As Louisa needed a good amount of time to recover, the whole family ended up going to Lyme, although Anne stayed behind at Uppercross as Lady Russell was now on her way back from Bath. As previously decided, she moved in with Lady Russell, and together they went for a visit at the Elliot family estate, where Admiral Croft and Mrs. Croft were now living as tenants. Wentworth wasn't there anymore, though, as he was still held up in Lyme, but he had asked about Anne, which had made her very pleased to hear. Later, they find out that the Admiral will leave for a while to visit friends in another county, and thus Anne thinks that she will no longer be in any danger of running into Wentworth. Eventually, Mary and husband Charles return from Lyme with tidings that Louisa was starting to feel better, but was still too weak to travel home. Christmas came and went, and Louisa was still in Lyme, and Wentworth was off with family somewhere else. Soon enough, Anne and Lady Russell left for Bath to join Anne's father and sister Elizabeth. Anne had heard in letters from her sister that over the past few weeks they were frequently visited by Mr. Elliot, their cousin who was heir to the estate. He was apparently very charming, and everyone adored him and were quick to forgive him for being so distant with them in the past. And since he was a widower, Elizabeth seemed to have renewed her hopes of marrying him. Mr. Elliot came for a late visit on Anne's first evening there, and she saw immediately that it was indeed the same man who had given her admiring looks in Lyme. I should mention that a friend of Elizabeth's is also staying with them in Bath. Her name is Mrs. Clay, although her husband was apparently not great. The details are a bit hazy on that one. But she had to get away from him, and Elizabeth took her under her wing. But Mrs. Clay is apparently quite shallow, and Anne immediately suspects Mrs. Clay of trying to charm her father into marrying her, which would be very bad. But Bath shenanigans move forward quite smoothly. They continue socializing with Mr. Elliot, and Lady Russell is there a lot too, and she very much approves of Mr. Elliot and wants him to marry Anne rather than Elizabeth. Anne isn't much for the social scene, however, and often goes on her own to visit an old school friend who was staying in Bath as well. This friend, Mrs. Smith, is a poor and disabled widow. Sir Walter finds it very distasteful that a daughter of his should choose such company over their more wealthy and noble connections, but Mr. Elliot, on the other hand, admires her for it. This somehow convinces Lady Russell that he will propose to Anne, but Anne is starting to feel a little bit weird about Mr. Elliot. Like he's almost a bit too nice, and this, compared to having basically ignored them all up until now, is a bit suspicious, to say the least. So Anne has been in Bath for about 1 month now when she gets a very interesting letter from Mary back at Uppercross. Aside from a lot of random complaining about no one visiting her, she also mentioned that Louisa had finally recovered enough to return home, and lo and behold, she is engaged, but not to Captain Wentworth. It is none other than Captain Benwick, that shy, introverted man that Anne had given book tips to. Anne is very much surprised, but also overjoyed at this, as it means Wentworth is not marrying Louisa after all, and it raises her hopes once more. And just at this time, Admiral Croft and his missus arrive in Bath, who we know are Wentworth's relations. And without them knowing it, Captain Wentworth was also on his way there, and the very next time Anne was out and about, she saw him. And they have an awkward exchange, but they are friendly, and when she said that she was walking home, he showed concern, as it was, after all, raining a bit. But she assured him that she would be fine, just as Mr. Elliot came up, ready to walk her home. And it was quite clear that Wentworth recognized him as the gentleman who had admired Anne back in Lyme. Anne becomes increasingly distracted after this, always wanting to run into Wentworth, which of course happens rather quickly. They meet again at a local concert where they shared a friendly moment before the concert started. He was very warm in his attitude now, and when they spoke of the unexpected engagement between Louisa and Benwick, he did not seem at all bothered by it. On the contrary, he gave the impression of having no particular regard for Louisa. So the concert starts and Anne is seated by Mr. Elliot, who speaks to her in a somewhat suggestive way. Or at least as suggestive as it gets for a Jane Austen novel. He admits to having known of her character since a good while back, that they had a mutual friend who had spoken so warmly of Anne that it had made him really want to meet her and get to know her. He wouldn't say, however, when Anne asked who this mutual friend was. But he did go on to say that he wished for Anne's name to never change, which, is the suggestive part of this conversation. This made Anne quite flustered, and much to her despair, Wentworth had seen this exchange, and his attitude towards her became much colder after this, and then he left the concert early. The next day, Anne visits her friend, Mrs. Smith, who had apparently heard all the gossip from the previous night. Mrs. Smith makes some comments about Anne and Mr. Elliot, hinting that they will probably get engaged soon. Anne denies this firmly and repeatedly, which is when Mrs. Smith makes a very shocking revelation. She reveals that Mr. Elliot is actually a cruel, cold-hearted man, that he was a close friend of her late husband's and spent so much time at their house, Mrs. Smith even started regarding him as a brother. So we now know who the mutual friend was that Mr. Elliot had mentioned. But this was back when he had no fortune, which was also when he had avoided the acquaintance of Sir Walter and his daughters. He had held no interest in the estate he would inherit from Sir Walter, other than what he might gain from selling it. He set his attentions on marrying a wealthy merchant's daughter instead, which he did, but it was an unhappy marriage which ended tragically when his wife passed away earlier that year. Mr. Elliot inherited a decent fortune from her and had started to see things a little differently. He became genuinely interested in the title that he was to inherit and decided to renew his acquaintance with Sir Walter for that reason, as well as making plans to marry Anne. whom, he had heard so many great things about. And she knew all of this because she was friends with a servant of a friend of Mr. Elliot's. Anne was very upset to hear all of this, but she had known that something wasn't quite right about Mr. Elliot. Mrs. Smith then shared something even worse, that it had been Mr. Elliot's influence over her late husband that had ruined them financially. Her husband had even made him the executor of his will, a responsibility that Mr. Elliot had completely ignored, consequently making life even more difficult for Mrs. Smith, who had no means to access money that was rightfully hers. Needless to say, Anne now had a lot to think about. But then she gets distracted as her family is visited by none other than Mary and Charles. Anne comes back with them to their hotel where they are staying with Mrs. Musgrove and Henrietta, who had also gone to Bath to buy some wedding things for her upcoming wedding with Charles Hayter. And soon enough, the hotel apartment was full of visitors and old friends, including Captain Wentworth. Anne observed him closely and they exchanged a few awkward sentences, but he was still cold and distant. The next day, Anne is back at the Musgroves' hotel apartment and she's standing with Captain Harville talking about Louisa and Benwick's engagement. Harville expressed disappointment in his friend Benwick, since Benwick had recently been engaged to Harville's sister, but she had died before the wedding. That was less than a year ago, so he is shocked that his friend could move on so soon. But Anne proclaims that men move on much faster than women and don't feel the loss of love as strongly as women do. But Harville disagrees. As they're chatting, Captain Wentworth is sitting close by writing a letter, and Anne is certain that he can hear them. Afterwards, Harville and Wentworth are leaving, but Wentworth turns and leaves the letter on the desk with one distinct look at Anne. She opens the letter and finds it to be everything she had hoped for. He admits to still loving her just as much as when their engagement got broken 8 years previously, and the fact that he was still unmarried had kept him hoping and was the only reason why he even came to Bath. So of course Anne sets off to walk home and she finds him along the way and they go off together, finally talking openly and honestly about everything that had happened and how much they both still decide to be together. Everything was a pretty done deal after that. No one opposed to them marrying now. Captain Wentworth had accumulated a fortune of £25,000 after all. But what about Mr. Elliot? Well, he alienated himself from Sir Walter and the family once again. He set himself up in London with none other than Mrs. Clay, whom everyone had feared was trying to con Sir Walter into marrying her. So that was a bit of a twist. And of course, things turn out better for Mrs. Smith as well, whom Anne continued being friends with after marrying. Captain Wentworth took over the legal battles of her husband's will and managed to secure some income for her. So all is well and good. The end. I want to start by saying that this wasn't my favorite Jane Austen novel. Although I haven't read all of them, I still have Mansfield Park left. But my initial impression is that Persuasion wasn't as immersive as I wanted it to be. Most developments are told through narration rather than shown through actual scenes, which removes opportunities for character moments and just overall lessens my impression of these characters. For example, the first time that Anne and Wentworth meet after 8 years apart, that was all narration. We were just told that this was an awkward first meeting. And there are many more situations like that throughout the story. And to go back to the beginning where I said that I had DNF'd this once before, this is the reason why. I'm not saying that it's a bad book by any means. There are plenty of positives in it as well, and we will talk about those too. Let's just get into the first discussion point, which I call breaking the Jane Austen formula. So if we look at Jane Austen's novels in general, we find a very simple premise. A man of good fortune finds himself a wife. Of course, the female protagonists have all been of varying degrees of wealth, but despite their circumstances changing, they are either members of the landed gentry or upper middle class. That is why I was immediately intrigued by this sudden change in the premise. Contrary to the other male leads in previous novels, Captain Frederick Wentworth is a self-made man. 8 years prior to the story setting, he was a young sailor of no particular importance, and the only reason why he even met Anne Elliot, I believe, was because his brother was a clergyman who had spent some time at Uppercross. He makes for a very refreshing romantic interest, as it is a bit of a formula break. He's ambitious, determined, and charming, traits that I am sure helped him a lot in his career. When he and Anne first got engaged, he was no lovesick fool. He knew that he couldn't provide for them yet at that point. But he promised her that he would become wealthy, and even though she still let him go, he stayed true to his promise and his love for her. And I find that really romantic. I just wish that we had more scenes with him that showed all of these traits in action. As it is now, everything is a bit of a guessing game, as he and Anne have no meaningful interactions until about the last 10% of the book. Speaking of Anne, overall, I found Anne to be a rather disappointing protagonist. Throughout the first half of the book, she barely says or does anything. She only observes what other people are saying and doing, pretty much. It wasn't uncommon for me to forget that Anne was even in a scene. And I wasn't the only one. Even the other characters forgot that Anne was there. Ooh, here comes the sun. Oh. Comes the sun. Oh. Ugh, isn't it nice when you get an unexpected delivery? It wasn't uncommon for me to forget that Anne was even in the scene. And I wasn't the only one. Even the other characters forgot that Anne was there. Sometimes, when Anne speaks in social situations, no one answers her. That is like an introvert's worst nightmare. Trust me, I would know. So Anne being rather uninteresting seems deliberate. And that's fine, that's okay. But when you compare this to the charms of Captain Wentworth, I don't know what he sees in her. I don't feel the tingle. I didn't ship these two. Personally, as a reader, I need to feel their personality to be able to ship a couple. But Anne is just too much of a perfect character without any flaws. She is modest and sensible and down to earth, and she thinks rationally in a crisis, and she chooses her friends based on personality rather than social status. Oh, and she is of course very pretty, but she doesn't have a vein bone in her body. The combination of all of these positive traits just makes it feel like she's not a real person, which she isn't. She is a fictional character, but you know what I mean. Another pet peeve of mine with Anne is that she spends so much time overthinking every single word and movement of Captain Wentworth. And as a notorious overthinker myself, I couldn't help but cringe when reading this. It was relatable, but in the worst possible way. It was like a bad smell lingering in the air after every scene that involved him. I found this to be an excellent opening for a character flaw, You know, she overthinks everything, so it's difficult for her to make decisions, hence why she allowed herself to be persuaded by Lady Russell to end the engagement the first time. But it wasn't portrayed that way at all, and I just found that to be a missed opportunity. So to conclude my thoughts about Anne, she just didn't hook me in the same way that Elizabeth did in Pride and Prejudice or Emma in Emma. And I think my disappointment was bigger now since I already knew what Jane Austen was capable of in terms of character work. Which brings me to the next point. Odd pairings, a couples analysis. So the thing I love the most about Jane Austen novels are the couples. But since we've already talked about Wentworth and Anne, I want to highlight some of the others that I find interesting. Number 1, Mary and Charles Musgrove. Mary is actually my favorite character. She is the youngest of the Elliot daughters, and she's convinced that she is the most important person in her circle. But she lacks self-awareness, which is why this is so comical. Whenever she feels like she's not getting enough attention, she claims to be ill. Except for when there's a social gathering going on, then she is miraculously not ill anymore. In general, whenever Mary was on the page, I was thoroughly entertained. She's a bit like a young Mrs. Bennet, which is probably why I like her so much. And then we have sweet husband Charles. He's nothing at all like his wife, he's a sensible man, and he cares a lot about his family. When Louisa had her accident in Lyme, he had a very strong reaction, and Anne remarked on him being a very loving brother. I actually think that Charles would have been an excellent match for Anne had she not still been hung up on Wentworth. But alas, he had to make do with Mary. And he has this impressive acceptance about his wife's self-centric behavior. He knows how she is, but he doesn't let it get to him. He even makes fun of her sometimes, which is absolutely hilarious. For example, when they're in Bath, Charles had ordered theatre tickets for all of the Musgroves, but Mary was completely panicked by this as it happened to be on the same evening as they were invited to Sir Walter's for card games, and there was going to be some very important people there. She couldn't possibly miss a social gathering to go and see a play, and she insisted that Charles had already accepted Sir Walter's invitation. But Charles replied that he had done no such thing. He had bowed and smiled and mumbled the word happy. That is not the same as accepting. Mary was not amused. This is an excellent example of some quirky and fun character moments that is typical Jane Austen, and again, I just wish we had more of them in this book. Number 2, Louisa and Captain Benwick. We see quite a lot of Louisa in the beginning of the book. She's definitely a very lively young woman and steadfast in her opinions. She's extroverted, adventurous, pretty much the polar opposite of Benwick, whom she barely even spoke to during their planned visit to Lyme. And then the accident happened. Wow, the sun is really strong all of a sudden. One could of course argue that hitting your head really hard could cause some personality-altering effects as well as psychological trauma, but let's set aside those possibilities for a moment. I think Louisa always had it in her, but now as she was recovering, she was forced to take it easy and amuse herself in other ways. Enter Benwick, the introvert who loves books. He's calm and gentle, and he reads to her, making her feel safe and taken care of. I find it very plausible that people can fall in love under these circumstances. It was a bit of a twist when we first learned this through Mary's letter, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense in my opinion. Number 3, Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay. This one is quite raunchy, if I may say so myself. There was no sign, that I could detect at least, that there was anything going on between these two throughout the book. On the contrary, Mr. Elliot had expressed severe dislike towards Mrs. Clay when he was speaking about her to Anne, as he was also under the impression that she wanted to marry Walter, Sir Walter. That, of course, would have been potentially disastrous for Mr. Elliot. He was Sir Walter's heir, and if Sir Walter remarried and had more children, perhaps even sons, then Mr. Elliot would lose his future inheritance. So their conclusion is told to us in retrospect, so we don't actually know the details, but I can imagine Mr. Elliot realizing that Anne wouldn't marry him, and then deciding to confront Mrs. Clay with a proposition. Maybe he threatened to expose her, who knows? But he must have offered her to come with him, as it is stated that she did go to London to live with him under his protection, which means that she was his kept mistress. I told you it was raunchy. I think it was a way to show just how much of an opportunist Mr. Elliot really is, that he would willingly take on a mistress just to make sure she wouldn't risk his inheritance. I'm sure many people have wondered over the title of this book, as it's somewhat different from other Jane Austen novels. We have Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, and then Persuasion. I find it interesting that it is the only one-word title, except for Emma, but Emma is a name, not a word. As Jane Austen could easily have made this similar to the Pride and Prejudice model, with the main couple of the story being represented in the title. But she didn't, and I find this significant. The theme of persuasion is all over this book. First off, Anne represented the persuadable mind, whereas Louisa was the unyielding one, which ultimately ended up causing the accident, as she wouldn't listen when Wentworth tried to persuade her not to jump a second time. There's also a bit of a butterfly effect in this theme of persuasion, not only in Anne being persuaded to let go of Wentworth after the first engagement, but also in Sir Walter being persuaded to get a tenant for his estate and move his family to Bath, which ultimately ended up being the reason why Wentworth even came back to Uppercross. There's also a lot of micro-persuasions scattered throughout the novel, with characters persuading or trying to persuade each other in various ways. So to sum this up, this book isn't about a particular character's personality trait. It's not one person being persuaded. Persuasion in various forms is all around them, all the time, and I think that is quite clever. I want to know what you people watching think of this book or this video, so please leave all of your thoughts and opinions down in the comments. Or if you just want to say hello, that would be fine too. If you enjoyed this video, then don't forget to give me a thumbs up, and if you really want to make my day, then you might also consider subscribing. You can also follow me on Instagram for some slightly more frequent updates. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you back next time.